Okay, there's the URL for it if you want to find a lot more information about it. But what I'll say about it, just briefly now, is that, I mean, it's a completely crazy idea, but that doesn't matter because it was something that I sort of had I sort of thought about and I talked about with some friends and some collaborators, and I wanted to create this messaging device, communication device that communicated really, really slowly. So the world of communication, especially in the internet age, and in South Korea, you're very aware of this. Like the network wants to move as fast as possible. We don't want things to go slowly. We don't want any interruptions in the communication. And I just sort of scratched my head and I said, well, what would a world be like if communication happened very slowly? If it was more something like the era, in past centuries, where it sometimes you couldn't even be sure if a letter would get delivered to someone else, or where the systems for communicating, like the postal service, didn't exist, and I would give a letter to someone who said that they were going to be going to some foreign land, and I said, look, just take this with you, try to get it to my cousin, who I think lives, last time he lived, at this, down this street, probably the last house on the left, but his name is this, and he's about 6 feet tall and he's got brown hair. And that's how you actually communicated. So there was never this, you couldn't be sure that a message would get delivered. And there's something to me that was quite, of course, very different from the way things are today, but I wanted to explore the possibility that that communication didn't happen quickly, and that there were other constraints and other requirements tied to the communication. And so I built this device, and so it really works. It's it's got a single character display on it, and it can accept a message, and then you can only see that message after a certain amount of time, and that time can be several days. And the message, you can't just leave it there to look for the message. The message, it's got a sensor built into it, basically an accelerometer, so that the message, the device is sensitive to you moving. So you have to actually walk with it, and that walking contributes to the message coming out of the device and being displayed one letter at a time on it. And so this is a completely crazy idea. This is not something that I would propose as a product, but it's what I would call like a material exploration of an idea. So rather than just sort of stopping and thinking, talking to a friend and saying like, what do you think of this idea? And they would say like, well, that's a crazy idea. And I might say like, yeah, but let's just talk about it. Let's discuss it, and let's discuss try to understand why I feel inspired to have this conversation about it, to discuss it, and to let's use it as a way to understand why the world is always going faster and faster and faster and faster. What about a world that slows down or offers opportunities for people to slow down and to have their communication not be at the speed of light? And then we start getting into a sort of very rich discussion about this particular theme. And it might not be to actually, because we want the world to slow down, but it's because we want to talk about the issues. We want to imagine a world where maybe there's some areas where you can go slowly, you can communicate slowly. And so the idea of design fiction is to go one step beyond just having that conversation. It's to go one step beyond telling that story about it and actually building something. So using for skills that you might have, and I just happen to have sort of engineering skills, so I can construct circuits like this, but there can be many ways in which you can materialize the idea and create it and build it as if it were a real thing, as if someone said, here is your engineering brief, here are the requirements and the specifications, here's the design brief, and you go ahead and do it. And something wonderful happens when you actually materialize it, as opposed to just thinking about it, or as opposed to just having a conversation. So you start learning about the idea in a much richer way, with much more depth, than if you had just stopped at that one conversation, or if you stopped at a diagram. And so that's that idea of combining the material practices, this thing that I mentioned, combining material practices with the knowledge practice, or how you explore an idea. And I tend to make things that are what I would call speculative, or they're like fictions, little fictional objects. But I think that's just one possibility. I think that as a creative sort of tool, as a way of exploring new ideas, I think, taking an idea and prototyping it is quite a valuable exercise. And I think every time that I've done that, or we've done that in the studio here, we learn something more that we could not have learned if we just came up with the idea and stopped there. And I think this is quite important, especially for what I understand that you guys are doing. It's to actually use that prototyping, that making, sort of getting and sort of fabricating something, is actually part of the design process. So it's not the thing that you do just at the end. So it's about thinking, but also making things in order to help you think more about your idea. And it's a very rewarding practice. And this one, the slow messenger, things got quite crazy. So made a bunch of different versions of it, experimenting with different kinds of displays, and a lot of these things were based on conversations that happened when I built the first one. People saw it and it's like, oh, that's kind of weird, and it's curious, and we started talking about would you only want one display, and the one display is sort of very much like what you might see for a telegraph. So when things were sent by Morse code, and then we started thinking about, well, can we make it look like like a larger display to see all the characters rather than just seeing one at a time. And so you begin iterating and redesigning and all that stuff. Again, it's not meant to come up with the perfect device. It's meant to essentially, I think about the concept by making it, rather than waiting until I figure the concept out and then making it, which is typically there's in the real world of companies that do industrial design and build products and all that kind of stuff. There often isn't a whole lot of prototyping. Essentially, someone will have an idea, they'll propose it. That proposal is sort of discussed, and it's weighed mostly based on technical feasibility, but also the business issues and business concerns. And then when someone decides that it should be done, the work begins on designing it. But then it stops, and then once they've figured everything out, then they just go ahead and build it. And the prototyping, there's not so much prototyping happening during the design phase. And what I would say is that prototyping absolutely has to happen right from the beginning to help you understand what it is you're trying to build and what it will be like when people have it in the world. So part of the reason for taking this approach, and particularly this approach of extending an idea beyond fact and putting it into the world of fiction, where it is really speculation and it's new ideas and things that maybe seem impossible, is to remember that there were times when the world that we live in today, in 2010, seemed impossible. So a lot of the things that we have around us, people would have laughed at, and they would have said, like, well, that's just science fiction. That's never going to exist. Everything from people going to the moon, people living in space, to people having, computers in their pocket that have incredible capabilities and powers and allow, for example, me to be sitting here in Los Angeles talking to you live in Seoul. And so just remembering that just because things are the way they are today doesn't mean that they can't be different, and doesn't mean that even the craziest idea couldn't be a possibility. So I think it's very important to hold on to that sense of looking outside of the box and beyond what people conventionally expect the world to be like in a few years, and using that not as a way to say that this idea will be possible very soon, but using it as a way to remember that you shouldn't constrain yourself in terms of your own creativity, in terms of what you might want to express through whatever creative practice or design practice you focus on. And so this is, part of what I'm trying to underscore here is that you can make different kinds of ideas, make different kinds of knowledge, or make different kinds of objects through this combination of art, engineering, and design. So bringing those three together. And early on, when I mentioned this idea of undisciplined creative practices, this is part of that, allowing there to be crosstalk and conversations between a variety of typically very traditional disciplines. So artists do art, engineers do engineering, and designers do design. And I'm saying no, that's not the best way to do things. There should be all of those things operating at the same time. And from my perspective, I think even all of those things operating at the same time within one individual. So an individual who's able to practice, both as an artist, as an engineer, and as a designer at the same moment, at the same time, I think is something that leads to very, very, very good new kinds of ideas and creative projects. So, how do you do this? It's a good question. Well, I learned a bit from this guy. So this is a painting. It's called "Experiment with a Bird in the Air Pump," and it was done by a fellow called Richard Wright. And he was basically it's at the Royal Museum in London. That's where it hangs now. And what's going on in this diagram is, back in the 19th century, in order for ideas to spread, in order for new science ideas to be brought around, brought around the United Kingdom, essentially you had to have a bit of money, so you had to be able to afford to have a scientist spend time with your family to basically educate the children and share the knowledge of the day and all the things that were going on in the world. So there was no internet, of course, and so these traveling experimenters used to go around and show people what was going on in the world. And in this case, they were showing that Robert Boyle had invented the air pump, which is a very important invention in the history of science. Basically, it showed that there was the possibility that there could be a vacuum, there could be a space where there was no air. And this was something that in the 19th century, this was like inventing nuclear power. It was really the big science of the day. It was something that most people thought was entirely impossible. Even the church, the Pope, had a lot of problems with this spiritually, and so it raised all these really important issues. And the interesting science, the science is very interesting about this, of course, but what was almost more interesting is how it changed people's perception about how the world works. And this is one of those points where we remember that the world hasn't always been the way it's been. So the fact that there was a time when people were absolutely sure that there couldn't be a place where there was no air, and then it was sort of demonstrated and gradually changed how people perceived the world was quite important. And what was perhaps most intriguing about this experiment